It was Harold Wilson who said that a week was a long time in politics. The last couple of weeks have been a very long time indeed, and there are still considerable uncertainties about the situation. In the referendum, a majority of the people of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. And Theresa May, who will take over tomorrow as Prime Minister, has said that Brexit means Brexit, to reassure people that it might not mean that. But we don't know yet what precise form the withdrawal from Europe will take. And there are plenty of people talking about coming to some agreement with the European Union, and we don't know what form that takes. I must say, speaking personally, I look on that language of that nature with deep suspicion, because I suspect there are people who would do all they could to undermine the result of the referendum, and while pretending to take us out, try and get us once again embedded within it. And that, I think, would be most undesirable. Now, those uncertainties will become clear quite soon. If you want a concise statement of what we ought to be doing with regard to the European Union, can I refer you to the speech in last week, and I'm getting terribly old these days, our former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, in 5 or 6 minutes, spelled out exactly what should be done. So if you want something that's tight and well thought through, look at that. I find myself completely in agreement with what he's saying. There is, however, one downside, or it's said that there is a downside about this, with regard to how we're going to deal with the problems that there are in our vicinity, in our part of the world. And those problems you've already touched on with regard to what is happening in the Middle East. But the problems include the issue of Russia. Now, I've just finished reading an excellent book by a chap called Harding, I think the name was, A Very Expensive Poison. It's about the Litvinenko case and the eventual way in which that was resolved with the inquiry that was established to look into it. But what comes out very clearly from that case is that with Russia, we are not dealing with a normal power. Russia is now a mafia state. Putin has close personal relationships with organized crime. And they're enriching themselves, and indeed the levels of corruption within Russia are steadily rising. By levels of corruption, I mean a steadily increasing proportion of the revenue of the state is being misappropriated. And the corruption levels are getting worse. What's going to happen there, it's not sustainable. And Putin himself, as you can see, is quite volatile. And he likes to surprise people, which he has done on a number of occasions. And we have not found an effective response to what he's doing. I mean, what he did with the Crimea and the Ukraine, and you look at the reaction of the international community, was not very effective. We don't know where the next steps are going to go. He's increased heavily his involvement in Syria. Said a few weeks ago that he was withdrawing his forces from Syria, but he hasn't. He's in fact sent more forces into Syria since the statement that he was going to withdraw. So we don't know how that's going out. His intervention in Syria has been quite crucial in affecting the area. I expect our councillor here will know more about this, but the impression I have is that the Assad regime was on its last feet and about to collapse when the Russians quickly increased their aid to them, and not just the Russians, but also Hezbollah are heavily involved there. In fact, there may not be all that many Syrians fighting for the Assad these days. Most of the people I heard carrying out his war against his own people are now coming from Iran and coming from other areas as well. So there's those uncertainties there. What do we do about it? I think we've obviously got to find ways of cooperating. The best way, if we're thinking in terms of the military conflict, is with regard to NATO. I see that I suspect the European Union will continue its project of trying to undermine NATO and think that it'll be easier for them to do so now that we're no longer there. But we'll see where that goes. The people in Europe talk quite a lot about developing a military capability, but they deliver very little in terms of it. I do remember at one stage during the Libyan situation, we got word, the common security and defence and foreign policy aspect of the EU had for some time a military element, and still has in theory a military element, and they said that they were forming combat groups. And we had word that they were thinking of sending one to Libya, and quickly tried to find out exactly what they were doing. And the Brussels said to us, "Oh no, we're just going to send this out to escort a humanitarian effort to give medical supplies and all the rest of it into Libya." And we inquired, "Where are you going to send this to?" And it was Misrata that they were going to go, which was an area where there was heavy conflict, where they would not have been able to land peaceably. So they were talked out of that. But the European Union is hankering after some sort of military activity without actually having the capacity to do so. Mind you, our own capacity has been undermined by the financial crisis, and one hopes that we'll be able now to recover somewhat with that regard, because our influence and our effectiveness does depend to some extent on having a military capability that is there. And we shall see. Once we get through the next year, well, I was going to say once we get through the next year, things will be better when there's been a change in the presidency in the United States, but we're not quite sure of the nature of that change, whether it will really be one for the better or not. But, we have those uncertainties. But it's really, and I just think we'll probably want to refer more to this, but we've got this turmoil in the Middle East, and there's very much, it may very well be that we can never put Iraq together again, because it is now effectively being partitioned. Whether Syria can ever be put back together again, highly unlikely. With the Russian support for Assad, we're likely then to see some form of cantonment developing. That the area which Assad's forces now largely control around Damascus, and then going up to the Mediterranean to the north, which is getting into the area where, as it were, his clans and his people come from. And then the other parts of Syria might head in other directions and all the rest of it. But we have those uncertainties. We've got that violence. We've got war down in Yemen, which is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then going further, into North America, into North Africa, there are huge problems there as well. And yet in the middle of it, Israel is a place of peace. Yes, there have been problems with the stabbings and the running down of people and all the rest of it. But it looks as though the Palestinian Authority, which largely created that problem, has now reached a point where it feels it's no longer doing them. It's past its usefulness, and that seems to be coming a bit calming down a little bit. There's likely to be problems from time to time, but Israel has always faced these problems and always managed to cope with them. And I don't think that is going to change. So we've got that curious situation, but there is at present very little prospect of any positive development in terms of trying to resolve the problem between Palestinians and Israelis, which I do think it is desirable to do so, because it's holding back the opportunity for Israel to form alliances with other Arab states. There are ways, you mentioned Iran, which is a threat to the other Arab states in the region. And there are areas there where Israel's interests and the interest of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and some of the Gulf states, where their interests are, come together. And you would normally expect to see that forming alliances forming as a result of that. But it's difficult for the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia to be formally working closely with, or publicly working closely with Israel, while the Palestinian situation is unresolved. And the irony of it is, we all know pretty well what the shape of the resolution will be. There have been previous negotiations that came close to success, and since then, not much has happened that will change the form of the outcome. The difficulty is that the Palestinians cannot do the deal. They cannot accept the responsibility for accepting and legitimating the existence of a Jewish state in the Arab lands. It's that emotional issue that holds back the resolution of this problem. And, well, I'll not want to go much further than that because it's at the moment difficult to see how the matter can be advanced. But one can take encouragement from the fact that Egypt and Jordan remain quite firm in their position on this matter. Okay, Egypt nearly went off, well, did in fact elect a Muslim Brotherhood government, but that's changed. And Jordan, despite all the problems that it has, it remains stable. And I think that's largely because of very substantial UK aid and support to Jordan. And I think that's hugely important that we ensure and we do all we can to keep, to assist the Jordanians in maintaining a stable state there, because I think that is hugely important. Now, I think I've gone more than 10 minutes, so I'll pause at that stage, and I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of this in the discussion.
Thank you very much.